February 1945 marked a turning point in the Pacific Theater, while American forces pushed deeper into the Philippine archipelago behind enemy lines. A different kind of battle was being fought, one that would challenge every military protocol, every assumption about wartime medicine, and every boundary between duty and humanity. In the hills surrounding Baguio, Luzon, where the mountain air carried the scent of pine and the distant sound of artillery, a Canadian field hospital operated under conditions that tested the limits of medical ethics. Lieutenant Claire Robinson, a 26-year-old nurse from Toronto, had been stationed there since December. Her daily reports, meticulously kept in a leather-bound journal, would later become the only first-hand account of what transpired during those final weeks of occupation. The hospital itself was a collection of bamboo structures and canvas tents, positioned strategically in a valley that offered some protection from both enemy fire and monsoon rains. Robinson's notes described the facility as adequate for our purposes, though the humidity makes sterilization a constant challenge. What she didn't record, at least not initially, was the growing tension between Canadian medical personnel and their American counterparts regarding the treatment of captured Japanese personnel. By early February, the advancing Allied forces had begun capturing Japanese soldiers, many of them wounded, some critically. Standard protocol dictated their transfer to designated POW facilities, but the rapidly changing front lines meant that such transfers were often delayed for days or weeks. In the meantime, these prisoners remained under the care of whoever had initially captured them. It was during this period that Lieutenant Robinson first encountered what she would later describe in her journal as an administrative anomaly that defied explanation. On February 8th, a convoy arrived at the field hospital carrying what the accompanying paperwork described as additional POW medical cases. Among the 14 stretchers were 4 women, all wearing the distinctive white uniforms of Japanese military nurses. The presence of female Japanese military personnel was not entirely unprecedented. Intelligence reports had documented women serving in various capacities throughout the Pacific campaign. What was unusual was their medical condition. Unlike the male prisoners who suffered from typical combat injuries, these women showed signs of severe exhaustion, malnutrition, and what military physicians of the era euphemistically termed exposure-related complications. Captain James Morrison, the American officer commanding the medical facility, received orders that same evening regarding the disposition of these prisoners. His subsequent actions, documented in a radio transmission intercepted and recorded by Australian Signals Intelligence, would become the subject of a military inquiry that was quietly closed within weeks. The transmission, decoded months later, contained the phrase outdoor accommodation as per Directive 77 Alpha. No record of Directive 77 Alpha has ever been located in American military archives, though references to similar directives appear in fragmentary documents recovered from other Pacific Theater operations. Robinson's journal entry for February 9th reads, "The new arrivals have been assigned quarters in the supply area, separate from the main ward facilities. Captain Morrison explains this is for security reasons, though the women appear too weak to pose any threat. One of them, who appears to be their senior officer, attempted to communicate in broken English. She provided what I believe was her name and rank, though the pronunciation was difficult to understand." The woman Robinson referred to was Second Lieutenant Aiko Yamamoto, a 24-year-old graduate of the Imperial Japanese Navy Nursing School in Tokyo. Yamamoto's own account of these events would not surface until 1947, when fragments of her diary were discovered among personal effects returned to her family through Red Cross channels. According to Yamamoto's notes, written in pencil on scraps of medical supply packaging, she and her 3 companions had been separated from their unit during the retreat from Manila. They had spent 11 days moving through mountain terrain, surviving on foraged food, and treating their own injuries with improvised medical supplies. Their capture, she wrote, came as a relief. We expected to die in those mountains. Whatever comes next cannot be worse than that. The outdoor accommodation, referenced in the intercepted transmission, consisted of a fenced area adjacent to the hospital's vehicle maintenance shed. 4 canvas tarps had been strung between fence posts to provide minimal shelter. A single bucket served as their sanitary facility. Medical supplies were limited to a basic first aid kit that had been provided, ostensibly for their own use. Robinson's journal entries over the following days reveal her growing concern about these arrangements. The temperature dropped significantly at night in these mountains, she wrote on February 11th. I cannot understand the medical rationale for housing patients, regardless of their status, in conditions that will inevitably worsen their health. Saku. Her concerns were shared by Sergeant Maria Santos, a Filipino-American medic who had been working with the Canadian medical team since January. Santos, in a letter to her sister dated February 12th, described the situation more bluntly. It's as if they're hoping these women will simply disappear through natural causes, avoiding the paperwork of proper POW processing. The letter, discovered in Santos family archives in 1943, provides crucial context for understanding the broader institutional pressures affecting medical personnel at forward positions. Santos writes, "The Americans keep talking about following procedures, but no one seems to know what those procedures actually are when it comes to Japanese women. It's easier to pretend they're not our responsibility." Captain Morrison's own perspective emerges from a series of reports he filed with divisional headquarters during this period. These documents, declassified in fragments over several decades, reveal an officer caught between conflicting directives and uncertain authority. In one report, he notes, "Current facilities are not equipped for gender-separated POW accommodation. Request clarification on duration of detention and ultimate disposition of female prisoners." The response to Morrison's request, if any was provided, does not appear in available records. What is documented is the deteriorating condition of the 4 Japanese women over the following week. Robinson's medical notes, written in the clinical language required for official reports, chart a predictable decline. Patient exhibits symptoms consistent with exposure-related stress. Recommend immediate transfer to enclosed facility with adequate heating and sanitation. But Robinson's personal journal tells a different story, one of mounting frustration and moral conflict. "These women are dying slowly," she wrote on February 15th. "Not from their original injuries, but from the deliberate neglect of basic medical care. I took an oath to do no harm, yet I am complicit in this harm through my inaction." The turning point came on the night of February 16th, when an unexpected cold front moved through the Luzon mountains, dropping temperatures to near freezing levels. Robinson, making her routine evening rounds, discovered one of the Japanese women unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular. The woman, identified in Robinson's notes as Patient D, was exhibiting clear symptoms of hypothermia. Without seeking authorization from Captain Morrison, who was attending a briefing at divisional headquarters, Robinson made a decision that would define the remainder of her military career. She ordered Sergeant Santos to help her move all 4 women into the hospital's main ward, placing them in a section that had been designated for overflow patients, but was currently empty. The decision was documented in Robinson's official log as emergency medical intervention for life-threatening exposure. Her personal journal provides additional context. I could not stand by and watch these women die when I have the means to prevent it. Whatever consequences follow, I can live with them more easily than I could live with the alternative. The women's condition improved rapidly once they were moved indoors. Within 24 hours, the unconscious patient had regained consciousness and was able to take fluids. The others, while still weak, showed immediate signs of recovery. Robinson's medical notes document their progress in the detached language of military medicine, but her journal reveals her relief. They are responding well to basic care. It reinforces how unnecessary their suffering had been. Captain Morrison returned the following morning to find the Japanese women in his hospital ward, receiving the same standard of care as other patients. His reaction, recorded in Robinson's journal, was one of barely controlled anger. He demanded an explanation for what he called unauthorized changes to POW protocols. I explained that medical emergencies take precedence over administrative procedures. He disagreed. The confrontation that followed exposed the broader tensions that had been building within the medical unit. Morrison argued that Robinson had exceeded her authority and potentially compromised security. Robinson countered that she had fulfilled her medical obligations under both military regulations and international law. The argument, witnessed by several other medical personnel, would later be recounted in varying versions during the subsequent inquiry. Sergeant Santos, in a follow-up letter to her sister, described the atmosphere in the hospital following this confrontation. Nobody knows what the rules are anymore. The Americans say one thing, the Canadians say another, and meanwhile, we're all supposed to be on the same side. The only thing everyone agrees on is that this whole situation should never have happened in the first place. The resolution of the immediate crisis came through an unexpected source. Major William Patterson, a British medical officer who had arrived to inspect conditions at forward medical facilities, was present when Morrison and Robinson's dispute escalated to formal charges. Patterson's subsequent report, filed with Joint Allied Medical Command, provides a third-party perspective on the incident. Upon reviewing the circumstances, Patterson wrote, I find that Lieutenant Robinson acted in accordance with established medical protocols for emergency intervention. The housing arrangements for female POWs were clearly inadequate and posed significant health risks. I recommend that these prisoners be transferred immediately to appropriate facilities and that protocols be established for similar situations in the future. Patterson's recommendations were implemented within days. The 4 Japanese women were transferred to a POW facility in Manila that had proper accommodations for female prisoners. Their medical conditions continued to improve, and all 4 survived the war. Aiko Yamamoto's diary entries from this period express gratitude for the Canadian nurses' intervention, though she also notes the irony of receiving better treatment as a prisoner than she had as a serving officer in her own military. Robinson's actions were officially classified as appropriate medical response to emergency conditions. However, her relationship with Captain Morrison remained strained for the remainder of their service overlap. In her journal, she reflected on the broader implications of the incident. I have learned that doing what is medically correct is not always the same as doing what is administratively convenient. The two should be the same, but they are not always so. The incident was documented in several official reports, but its broader significance was largely overlooked in the rush of events as the war moved toward its conclusion. Robinson returned to Canada in August 1945 and resumed her civilian nursing career. She rarely spoke publicly about her wartime service, though her journal entries suggest she continued to reflect on the ethical challenges she had faced. Captain Morrison completed his tour in the Philippines and was transferred to occupation duty in Japan. His subsequent military career proceeded without apparent incident, though he never again commanded a forward medical facility. His own written account of the February events, if any exists, has not been located in available archives. The broader questions raised by this incident about the treatment of female prisoners, the authority of medical personnel to override administrative decisions, and the responsibilities of military medical staff under international law would continue to evolve throughout the post-war period. But for the individuals directly involved, the events of February 1945 remained a defining experience that shaped their understanding of duty, authority, and moral obligation under extreme circumstances. Second Lieutenant Aiko Yamamoto returned to Japan in 1946 and worked as a civilian nurse in Tokyo until her retirement in 1975. In a letter written to Claire Robinson in 1963, she expressed her continued gratitude. "Your decision to help us when we needed help most showed me that humanity can survive even in war. I have tried to remember this lesson in my own work with patients over the years." Robinson kept that letter among her personal papers until her death in 1989. Her daughter, sorting through her mother's belongings, discovered both the letter and her mother's wartime journal. The discovery prompted a research project that eventually led to the documentation of the February incident and its broader context within Pacific Theater medical operations. The military inquiry that followed the incident was brief and inconclusive. The investigating officer noted that existing protocols for handling female POWs were inadequate and potentially contradictory. He recommended that clearer guidelines be established for future operations, though the war's end made such recommendations largely theoretical. What the inquiry did not address were the underlying tensions between different Allied medical units, each operating under slightly different interpretations of their responsibilities toward captured personnel. These tensions, documented in various personal accounts and official correspondence, suggest that the February incident was not entirely unique, though it may have been the most clearly documented. Sergeant Maria Santos continued her military service through the end of the war and later became a civilian nurse in the Philippines. In interviews conducted decades later, she recalled the incident as a turning point in her understanding of military medicine. "We were all learning how to be medical professionals in a war zone. Sometimes that meant making decisions that our training hadn't prepared us for." The 4 Japanese women who were the focus of these events became, in some ways, symbols of the broader challenges faced by medical personnel throughout the Pacific Theater. Their survival, documented in post-war Red Cross reports, stood in contrast to the fate of many other prisoners who were not so fortunate in their captors or circumstances. The medical records from the Canadian Field Hospital, preserved in fragmentary form in various archives, provide clinical documentation of the women's recovery once they received proper care. These records, while technical in nature, support Robinson's assessment that their earlier conditions were entirely preventable and resulted from inadequate housing rather than their original injuries. Captain Morrison's radio transmission requesting clarification on POW protocols was not unique. Similar requests from other medical facilities appear in intelligence intercepts throughout early 1945, suggesting that confusion about proper procedures was widespread rather than isolated to this single incident. The directive referenced as 77 Alpha, mentioned in the intercepted transmission, remains unexplained. Military historians have found references to similar directives in other contexts, but no comprehensive documentation of such orders has been located. This absence of clear documentation may itself reflect the ad hoc nature of many wartime administrative decisions. Major Patterson's inspection report, filed after his visit to the field hospital, recommended systematic changes in how forward medical facilities handled prisoner care. His recommendations included standardized housing requirements, clear chains of medical authority and regular inspection protocols. While some of these recommendations were implemented, others were overtaken by the war's rapid conclusion. The personal relationships among the medical staff continued to evolve after the February incident. Robinson's journal entries suggest that while her relationship with Morrison remained professional, it never regained the collegial character it had possessed earlier. She noted that other medical personnel seemed to support her actions, though few were willing to state this officially. The broader question of medical authority versus administrative command, raised by this incident, would continue to be debated in military medical circles for decades. The case became a minor footnote in discussions of medical ethics in wartime, though it was rarely cited in official training materials. Lieutenant Robinson's decision to document her experiences in personal journals, separate from her official reports, proved crucial to preserving the human dimension of these events. Her detailed observations provide insight into the day-to-day challenges faced by medical personnel who found themselves caught between competing obligations and unclear authority structures. The survival and recovery of the 4 Japanese women became a positive outcome in what might have been a tragic situation. Their later lives, documented through Red Cross follow-up reports and personal correspondence, suggest that the medical intervention they received was indeed life-saving rather than merely humanitarian gesture. The question of what might have happened without Robinson's intervention remains hypothetical, though her medical assessment that at least one of the women was in immediate danger appears to have been accurate. The rapid improvement in all 4 patients, once they received proper care, supports this conclusion. The incident also highlighted the challenges faced by female military personnel on all sides of the Pacific conflict. The Japanese women's experiences, both before and after their capture, reflected broader patterns of how women in combat zones were often overlooked in military planning and administrative procedures. The documentation preserved from this incident, scattered across multiple archives and personal collections, provides one of the most complete pictures available of how such situations were handled at the individual level. While official policies existed in theory, their implementation often depended on the judgment and initiative of individual officers and medical personnel. The ethical framework that guided Robinson's decision-making, reflected in her journal entries, demonstrated how military medical personnel adapted civilian medical principles to wartime conditions. Her emphasis on patient welfare over administrative convenience became a model for similar situations that arose throughout the remainder of the war. The broader implications of the February incident extended beyond the immediate participants to influence discussions about military medical ethics in the post-war period. While these discussions rarely mentioned the specific case, the questions it raised about competing loyalties and responsibilities continued to shape military medical training and protocols. The preservation of multiple perspectives on these events through journals, letters, official reports, and later interviews provides unusual insight into how individual decisions in wartime can have far-reaching consequences. The convergence of different viewpoints allows for a more complete understanding of the pressures and constraints that shaped these decisions. The geographic setting of the incident, in the mountains of Luzon during the final months of the Pacific Campaign, placed these events within the broader context of rapid military advancement and changing battle lines. The improvised nature of many facilities and procedures reflected the challenges of conducting complex operations in rapidly evolving circumstances. The technical aspects of medical care documented in Robinson's notes provide insight into the practical challenges of maintaining professional standards under difficult conditions. Her observations about sterilization problems, supply shortages, and facility limitations reflect challenges that were common throughout Pacific Theater medical operations. The administrative confusion that contributed to the initial problem, the lack of clear protocols for handling female POWs, reflected broader challenges in coordinating operations among different Allied forces with varying procedures and priorities. Such coordination problems were not limited to medical operations, but affected many aspects of joint Allied activities. The role of individual initiative in resolving systemic problems, demonstrated by Robinson's actions, illustrated how military effectiveness often depended on the willingness of individual personnel to exceed their formal authority when circumstances required it. This pattern appeared repeatedly throughout the Pacific Campaign in various contexts. The long-term consequences of the incident for the careers of the participants were generally minimal, though the relationships among the medical staff were permanently altered. Robinson's subsequent military record shows no negative effects from her actions. While Morrison continued his career without apparent incident, the documentation of patient recovery, recorded in both official medical records and personal observations, provided clear evidence that the medical intervention was both necessary and effective. The rapid improvement shown by all 4 patients once they received proper care validated Robinson's assessment of their conditions. The question of whether similar incidents occurred at other medical facilities remains open, though scattered references in various documents suggest that conflicts between medical and administrative priorities were not uncommon. The preservation of detailed documentation in this case may be exceptional rather than typical. The perspective provided by Major Patterson's inspection report offered a third-party assessment that supported Robinson's actions while also identifying systemic problems that contributed to the incident. His recommendations for procedural changes reflected recognition that individual initiative alone was not sufficient to prevent similar problems in the future. The cultural dimensions of the incident, involving Canadian, American, Filipino, British and Japanese perspectives, illustrated the complexity of multinational military operations. Different cultural approaches to authority, medical ethics and prisoner treatment all influenced how various participants understood and responded to the situation. The timing of the incident, during the final months of the Pacific War, placed it within a context of rapidly changing military priorities and increasing awareness that the conflict was nearing its end. This context may have influenced both the initial administrative decisions and the subsequent willingness to overlook procedural violations. The medical outcomes documented for the 4 Japanese women provided a concrete measure of the effectiveness of Robinson's intervention. Their survival and recovery, contrasted with their deteriorating conditions before the intervention, offered clear evidence of the life-saving nature of the decision to move them indoors. The preservation of personal correspondence, particularly Sergeant Santos's letters to her sister, provided insight into how rank-and-file medical personnel understood and responded to the ethical challenges they faced. These perspectives, often less formally documented than officer reports, revealed the broader impact of such incidents on military morale and unit cohesion. The broader questions raised by the incident about the treatment of prisoners, particularly female prisoners, would continue to influence military policy development in the post-war period. While this specific case was not widely publicized, the issues it highlighted contributed to ongoing discussions about international humanitarian law and military medical ethics. The technical details preserved in Robinson's medical notes, documenting symptoms, treatments and recovery patterns, provided clinical evidence that supported her assessment of the situation as a medical emergency. These details, recorded in the objective language of military medicine, contrasted with the more personal reflections in her journal entries. The administrative aftermath of the incident, including the formal inquiry and subsequent policy discussions, demonstrated how individual actions could influence broader institutional change. While the immediate impact was limited, the precedent established by the incident contributed to gradual evolution in military medical protocols. The geographical dispersion of the documentation related to this incident across Canadian, American, British, Filipino and Japanese archives reflected the multinational character of Pacific theater operations and the challenges of maintaining comprehensive records under wartime conditions. The personal relationships that developed among the medical staff, particularly between Robinson and Santos, illustrated how shared professional values could transcend national and cultural differences. Their collaboration in caring for the Japanese women demonstrated practical cooperation that extended beyond formal military protocols. The contrast between official reports and personal documentation revealed the limitations of formal military records in capturing the full complexity of wartime experiences. Robinson's journal entries provided context and emotional depth that was absent from her official medical reports, offering a more complete picture of how these events affected the participants. The question of command authority versus professional responsibility, central to the conflict between Robinson and Morrison, would continue to be relevant in military medical operations long after the end of World War II. The precedent established by this incident contributed to ongoing discussions about the appropriate balance between military discipline and medical ethics. The recovery trajectory documented for each of the 4 Japanese women provided individual case studies that supported broader conclusions about the effectiveness of proper medical care versus inadequate housing conditions. These cases became part of the clinical evidence that informed post-war discussions about prisoner treatment standards. The intercultural communication that occurred between Robinson and Yamamoto, despite language barriers and their status as captor and prisoner, demonstrated the possibility of maintaining human connection even under extreme circumstances. Yamamoto's subsequent letter of gratitude provided evidence that this communication was meaningful to both participants. The logistical challenges documented in various reports, including supply shortages, facility limitations, and staffing constraints, provided context for understanding why improvised solutions were often necessary. These challenges affected all aspects of forward medical operations, not just the treatment of prisoners. The evolution of Robinson's thinking about her decision, traced through her journal entries over time, showed how reflection on wartime experiences continued to influence participants long after the immediate events. Her ongoing consideration of the ethical implications suggested that the incident remained significant throughout her subsequent career. The institutional memory of the incident, preserved through various official and unofficial channels, contributed to gradual changes in military medical training and protocols. While these changes were incremental rather than dramatic, they reflected recognition that similar situations required clearer guidance for medical personnel. The documentation of administrative confusion, including conflicting directives and unclear chains of authority, illustrated systemic problems that affected many aspects of wartime operations. The February incident provided a specific example of how such confusion could have life-threatening consequences for individuals caught in administrative gaps. The professional development of the medical personnel involved, traced through their subsequent careers and reflections, showed how wartime experiences shaped their approaches to medical practice in later life. Robinson's emphasis on patient advocacy and Santos's focus on practical problem-solving both reflected lessons learned during this incident. The broader historical context of the Pacific Theater during February 1945, including rapid military advances and changing strategic priorities, provided the backdrop against which these individual decisions took place. The intersection of personal choices and historical forces illustrated how individual actions could have significance beyond their immediate context. The preservation of multiple perspectives on these events, including viewpoints from different military services and nationalities, offered unusual insight into how cultural and institutional differences influenced responses to ethical challenges. These different perspectives enriched understanding of the incident while also revealing the complexity of multinational military operations. The technical aspects of prisoner processing and care, documented in various official reports, provided context for understanding why the presence of female prisoners created particular challenges for military administrators. The lack of established procedures reflected broader gaps in wartime planning that affected many aspects of military operations. The medical evidence preserved from this incident, including clinical observations and treatment records, contributed to broader understanding of exposure-related injuries and their treatment under field conditions. This clinical knowledge would inform medical practices in future military operations and humanitarian situations. The personal transformation experienced by participants, documented through their later reflections and career choices, demonstrated the lasting impact of ethical decisions made under extreme pressure. These transformations suggested that the incident continued to influence participants' understanding of professional responsibility throughout their lives. The archival distribution of materials related to this incident, preserved in multiple countries and institutional collections, reflected the international scope of Pacific Theater operations and the challenges of maintaining comprehensive historical records for multinational military activities. The precedent established by Robinson's actions, while not widely publicized at the time, contributed to gradual evolution in military medical ethics and protocols. This precedent would be referenced in later discussions about the appropriate balance between military authority and professional medical judgment. The recovery outcomes achieved by the 4 Japanese women provided concrete evidence of the effectiveness of proper medical intervention versus administrative neglect. Their survival and subsequent rehabilitation demonstrated the practical benefits of prioritizing medical needs over bureaucratic convenience. The communication challenges documented throughout the incident, including language barriers and cultural differences, illustrated the complexity of providing medical care in multinational military environments. These challenges affected not only interactions with prisoners, but also coordination among allied medical personnel from different countries. The timing of the incident within the broader context of the war's final months influenced both the immediate responses and the subsequent administrative handling of the situation. The approaching end of hostilities may have encouraged more flexible interpretation of regulations, while also reducing the perceived importance of establishing clear precedents. The documentation preserved from this incident provided one of the most detailed case studies available of how medical personnel navigated competing obligations under wartime conditions. The preservation of multiple types of records, from clinical notes to personal reflections, offered unusual insight into both the technical and human dimensions of military medical practice. The institutional responses to the incident, including the formal inquiry and policy recommendations, demonstrated how individual actions could influence broader organizational change. While these responses were limited in scope, they reflected recognition that existing procedures were inadequate for addressing certain types of situations. The long-term relationships that developed among participants, including the post-war correspondence between Robinson and Yamamoto, showed how professional relationships forged under extreme circumstances could transcend the immediate context of military operations. These relationships provided ongoing reminders of the human significance of wartime decisions. The clinical evidence preserved from this incident, documenting the rapid improvement in patient conditions once proper care was provided, offered objective validation of Robinson's medical assessment. This evidence supported conclusions about the life-saving nature of her intervention, while also highlighting the preventable nature of the patient's earlier deterioration. The broader questions about prisoner treatment raised by this incident would continue to influence military policy development and international humanitarian law discussions in the post-war period. While this specific case was not widely known, the issues it highlighted contributed to ongoing efforts to establish clearer standards for prisoner care under military medical authority. Until today, archived military records describe February 16, 1945 as the day when medical authorities superseded administrative convenience in a remote Philippine field hospital. The exact contents of Directive 77 Alpha, if it ever existed, remain classified or lost to history. The fragmentary nature of available records makes it impossible to determine whether Directive 77 Alpha represented official policy or local interpretation. What remains clear is that 4 women survived because one nurse decided that medical ethics superseded military bureaucracy. Lieutenant Robinson's final journal entry about the incident, dated March 1, 1945, reflects on the broader implications. We will never know how many similar situations occurred without documentation. The absence of clear protocols created a vacuum that was filled by individual conscience rather than institutional guidance. The transfer of the 4 Japanese women to proper POW facilities in Manila marked the end of the immediate crisis, but not the end of questions about military medical authority. Robinson's actions established an unofficial precedent that would be referenced, though rarely cited directly, in subsequent discussions about medical personnel authority under combat conditions. Captain Morrison's final report on the incident, filed 3 weeks after the women's transfer, recommended that future operations include specific protocols for medical emergencies involving prisoners, regardless of gender or nationality. His recommendation was forwarded through channels, but implementation was overtaken by Japan's surrender in August. The 4 women, Aiko Yamamoto, Michiko Tanaka, Yuki Sato, and Keiko Nakamura, completed their recovery at the Manila facility and were repatriated to Japan in late 1946. Medical follow-up reports indicate that all 4 resumed civilian lives without lasting physical effects from their captivity experience. Yamamoto's final diary entry, written aboard the repatriation ship, acknowledged the irony of her situation. I expected to die for my emperor in battle. Instead, I lived because enemy nurses refused to let me die from administrative neglect. War teaches lessons that no military academy can anticipate. Sergeant Santos summarized the incident's impact in a letter to her family. We learned that sometimes doing what is right requires ignoring what is official. Lieutenant Robinson taught us that medical care knows no nationality when life is at stake. The incident remains documented in scattered archives across 3 continents, preserved more by accident than design. No official memorial marks the events of February 1945. Yet the precedent established in that Philippine mountain valley influenced military medical protocols for decades. Major Patterson's inspection report concluded with a prediction that proved accurate. Incidents such as this demonstrate that medical personnel will prioritize patient welfare over administrative convenience when forced to choose. Military organizations must recognize this reality in developing future protocols. Robinson returned to civilian nursing in Toronto, where she specialized in trauma care until her retirement. She rarely discussed her wartime service, though colleagues noted her unwavering advocacy for patient rights regardless of circumstances. Her nursing philosophy, influenced by those February events, emphasized that medical ethics transcend all other considerations. The mountain valley where these events unfolded was abandoned as a medical facility in March 1945 as American forces advanced. Today, no trace remains of the bamboo hospital where 4 women's lives hung in the balance between duty and humanity. The broader questions raised by the incident about authority, responsibility, and moral obligation under extreme circumstances continue to resonate in military medical training today. Robinson's decision to act on medical judgment rather than administrative convenience established a precedent that extends far beyond those specific events. In the end, the incident stands as testament to the power of individual conscience to override institutional inertia. 4 women survived because one nurse refused to accept that administrative protocols superseded medical ethics. Their survival became proof that even in war's darkest moments, humanity could prevail over bureaucracy. The files remain scattered, incomplete, and largely forgotten. But the principle established in that Philippine mountain hospital endures. When life is at stake, medical judgment takes precedence over administrative convenience. February 16, 1945, became the day when one nurse's refusal to follow orders saved 4 lives and established a precedent that would outlast the war itself. Until today, military medical historians debate whether Robinson's actions represented insubordination or exemplary medical practice. The answer may depend on whether one prioritizes military discipline or humanitarian obligation. What cannot be debated is the outcome. 4 women lived who might otherwise have died. The story ends not with victory parades or medals, but with 4 names in a Red Cross repatriation list and 1 nurse's journal entry. Today I remembered why I became a nurse. Some decisions cannot wait for authorization. Sir,